Good afternoon. We should start. Perhaps those in the back could come to the front to make it look better on TV. Well, it's the end of the day, and we've been very blessed in this World Congress to have quite a number of wonderful events. This afternoon we have another mega star of the iEA World Congress, Roger Myson. I won't introduce him. He just ordered me to give him more time for his talk instead of talking about him. Let me just say one little thing about him. I've known Roger for a number of years. He's one of the most unassuming Nobel laureates you will ever meet. There are a number of them. You met George Akerlof this morning, but Roger is, I think, in the same league in terms of humility. And this is not just, let me give you a small piece of empirical evidence for that. You look at his official CV and resume. There is a section on honors and recognition. And his Nobel Prize appears as number 9. That tells you something about his sense of priorities. I told him he's not Cameroonian like me. If he were Cameroonian, I think that you would know that he's a Nobel laureate before you even talk to him. And of course, Kaushik Basu. Kaushik was my boss, my last boss at the World Bank for many years. He's also a good friend. He will be discussing. There are two very different styles. I don't know how many of you have heard them speak. I think it was a great combination to have them together. They are two very different individuals in terms of the delivery. So of course, since Roger will be the main speaker, he'll be given about 30 minutes, 35, 37. 37 minutes, and then hopefully I will have enough time for Kaushik to intervene and comment for 15 minutes. We'll just, if they give me some time, I may say a couple of things. Otherwise, I'll just open it for questions. Roger?
Yes, it's a great privilege to do a plenary talk at the International Economic Association. I'm very, very grateful to have been invited and get to work. I want to talk about village communities and global development. The World Bank, let's see the slide. Let's go back. There we are. No, where are we? There we are. The World Bank policy report of making politics work for development observes in one of its concluding observations that not only are local governments the last mile of public service delivery, which national leaders may want to improve, but they are also the first mile at which citizens determine the platforms on which leaders are selected and sanctioned. That is, the point is that local government can be vital for economic development in two different ways. The first is that local government is responsible for providing local public goods and services that are essential for a prosperous community. But second, local government can be a basic point of entry into politics. And we economists understand that lower entry barriers can improve performance in any competitive system. Local leaders who provide good public services in local government can then be recognized as strongly qualified competitive candidates for higher offices. And so democratic local government can increase competitive incentives for better public service at all levels of government. I want to argue that successful development in a nation depends on an ample supply of leaders with good reputations for managing public resources responsibly in public service. And I think the best place to develop this vital supply of public political capital is in autonomous institutions of local government. Thus, I would argue, development economics is incomplete when comparative local politics is ignored. So today I want to take a broad historical view to argue that local political leadership has had a vital role at every stage of global development in the long history of humanity. As a guide to much of this story, I'm going to turn to a 19th century British jurist named Henry Sumner, Maine, who thought deeply about the history of Western law and about the problems of India under British rule, where he worked. But first, let me start with a broad theoretical and historical overview. We can interpret the folk theorem of repeated games as a fundamental model of how people who live together in a small community can discipline themselves to maintain virtually any pattern of joint behavior that may be adaptive for their survival. You know, the folk theorem is proven by strategy profiles in which anyone who deviated from his or her prescribed behavior would then suffer an adverse change of status in the community and so would be treated worse by others in the community thereafter. I'd conjecture that some aspects of these strategies that we use to prove the folk theorem might indeed be hardwired into our human brains, such as an inclination to judge the appropriateness of the behavior of others in the community that we identify with, and a reciprocal fear of losing status in the eyes of others in our community. In particular, trusted political leadership depends on a reputational equilibrium where one individual expects that the community will recognize him as a leader and will accord him special powers and benefits of high status, as long as he uses these powers to provide certain public goods or services, and otherwise he could lose this privileged status. Successful societies must be able to get people focused on such equilibria with some generally accepted leaders who can take responsibility for essential public goods that require coordination or management by one person. Such problems had to be solved among hunter-gatherer bands when our species first spread out of Africa to transform the world for the first time about 100,000 years ago. We may conjecture that one of the first uses of human language may have been for a band's leader to assign roles in a hunt or battle and then to distribute shares of any rewards from success, but also for others in the band to gossip about whether their leader had exercised his coordinating power appropriately. Then from about 10,000 years ago, the great transformative development of agriculture depended not just on some basic understanding of plants, but as Douglas North has remarked, on the ability of people in farming communities to defend their property rights, to benefit from the crops they had worked to plant and cultivate earlier in the year. Before the rise of states that could provide law and order across extensive regions, each village must have had the necessary leadership to fight for the defense of its territory against its neighbors and to negotiate agreements and alliances with them. Pre-modern states were typically established by an elite group who specialized in fighting and collecting tribute. The development of writing from about 4,000 years ago was essential for these state builders so that they could maintain networks of trust among themselves even when they dispersed to supervise the village communities under their protection. Now, the latest global transformation, modern economic development, has been catalyzed by the discovery of an amazingly high long-run elasticity of national output with respect to political reforms that extend legal and political rights to broader groups of the population, so that many more people are then empowered to demand better public services and so are encouraged to make greater private investments. A change in the relationship between local and national politics has been central in this transformation. In a modern state, national leaders are regularly accountable to the general population who vote in their communities, and trusted local leaders can regularly rise into national politics. But traditional states generally depended on an exclusive national nobility, who as a class had responsibility for supporting and maintaining the state. And so, in these traditional states, pre-modern, the state's protection of property rights was designed largely for the benefit of of this national political elite. As a guide to the local institutional structures of such traditional systems between the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, let's turn to Henry Sumner, Maine. Henry Sumner, Maine was a great British scholar in the history of law who in 1861 published a successful text on ancient law. And then he went to serve in India as a senior legal advisor to the British imperial government for the better part of a decade. And there he studied the legal problems that were arising in traditional Indian communities with a sensitivity that had developed in his long study of the laws of ancient Rome and medieval Europe. On his return to England, he gave a series of lectures at Oxford to describe a conceptual framework which he found to fit both European history and contemporary Indian developments. And this remarkable synthesis was published in 1871 as Village Communities in East and West. Maine didn't try to rule out the possibility that some similarities between villages in India and pre-feudal Europe were derived from maybe ancient Indo-European traditions, but clearly the broad similarities that Maine found in traditional village communities of East and West must be understood as a stable, adaptive strategy for a farming community to sustain itself when it doesn't have a reliable protection from a greater regional government. The major organizational features that 19th century Indian villages that he found shared with medieval Teutonic villages were summarized by Maine as follows. The territory of the community would be divided into the cultivated area, the areas of common fields or waste, and the residential area of the village. The cultivated area would be subdivided among the village households, but they had to cultivate their plots in a coordinated manner according to village rules, while the fields and waste areas were used in common by the whole village. In the village, each household was ruled by a recognized head of the family. Common economic transactions between the villagers were expected to be at customary prices. Disputes between the households would be resolved according to customary rules as defined by a village council or assembly. In his first book, Ancient Law, Maine had observed that before the growth of the Roman state, the laws of Rome were applied not to individuals, but to families, each of which was headed by a pater familias, who held despotic power over everyone else in the household. Relationships were regulated by people's generally recognized status, not by contracts, not by bilateral contracts. In his book, The Village Communities in the East and West, Maine saw that these communitarian principles were general characteristics of traditional villages, both in ancient Europe and in his contemporary India. Now, economists generally see advantages in assuming that any individual can own property. But we should recognize that in regions where no government exercises effective control, the property rights to land that are essential for agricultural development may not be enforceable without support from an entire community. Thus, before the establishment of an effective state, we should not be surprised to find communal property rights to be the norm in traditional autonomous villages. An individual might find it difficult to enforce a claim to valuable property alone without the support of other family members who share an interest in the claim. And a poor village, which could hardly afford to offer public adjudication for arbitrarily written contracts, might naturally limit its civil protection to the rights of social status as recognized by the community. Maine devoted one of his 6 lectures in the 1871 lectures to feudalization, that is, the transition from autonomous villages to feudal manors. He was deeply familiar with the feudal system as it had developed in medieval England because the legacy of feudalism still provided some of the basic principles of English land law. From this historical perspective, Maine found it remarkable to witness a process of feudal state building in regions of colonial India in his own time. When traditional autonomous villages, he remarked, come under the regional power of a sovereign state, They can gain some degree of peace from anarchic local warfare, but in exchange, they must sacrifice some autonomy and submit to taxation by the state. Maine observed that when a new province is annexed to a state, the first act of government must be to determine how much of the product from the land will be demanded by the sovereign state to defray its expenses. The result will inevitably be a redistribution of power in traditional villages, as the state must delegate some of its power to those who will serve its interests there. In particular, taxing remote villages may induce a state that has limited administrative ability to concentrate local power in the hands of a few individuals who can take responsibility for keeping order and collecting taxes for the state. Feudalism is the simplest way to integrate village communities into a larger state system. The territory of the village community becomes the manor of a feudal lord. The common lands become the lord's private domain, but village households become tenants who retain customary rights in the community's cultivated areas. The village council becomes the lord's court, with a lord as judge and villagers as jurors. In the process of medieval feudalization, many manor lordships were derived from grants by monarchs in exchange for service to the crown. But Maine noted that local lordships could also be defined by the states recognizing and elevating the position of an indigenous chief of a leading local family. Indeed, the distinction between a feudal manor and an autonomous village must be shaded by a recognition that autonomous village communities without a state regularly look to the head of one prominent family for leadership in any military action to defend the village. We should understand that a military operation requires a leader who can command people to perform dangerous action. Any military operation requires a leader who can command people to perform dangerous actions in battle, and who can be expected thereafter to have the power to distribute appropriate rewards for good service. Such leadership must inevitably be associated with privileges of power or moral hazard rents for the leader. Maine recognized, however, that even when a feudal lordship is bestowed on the traditional war leader or chief of a formerly autonomous community, there may be substantial historical injustice in the conversion of communal property into the private property of the lord. Most importantly, the state's recognition of the indigenous chief makes him a local lord whose position no longer depends on the community's approval of his public service. He is no longer accountable to the community. Although the conversion of an autonomous village into a feudal manor was generally directed by the interests of a larger state, Maine urged his readers to recognize some important local benefits of this transformation. First, an autocratic manor, he noted, may be more able to adopt new agricultural techniques more readily than a village where plans for cultivation each year require consensus among many households. But second, he said, although traditional autonomous villages are often described as democratic, Maine argued that they should actually be considered little oligarchies. And the element of oligarchic inequality in such villages, he said, actually tends to worsen when a state provides even minimally good regional government. Well, I hope that's readable, the quote, but I'll tell you. To understand this effect, we must remember that local hardships around the world have always driven some people to leave their homes and move to other communities, whether as refugees or as migrants or as indentured servants. Such immigrants arrive in a village with no claim to its land and resources, but they may earn a living by the labor that they can provide. If nothing compels the old village families to share the privileges of their status with newcomers, then the descendants of such immigration will eventually form a permanent landless underclass in the village community. But in the primordial chaos before the establishment of a state, a village would regularly face existential threats from invaders or from neighboring villages, and such crises could motivate villagers to offer full citizenship to all residents who fought for their community. This force for inclusion is eliminated when a state protects the village in a regional peace. Thus, as Maine said, if the state provides even tolerably good government while permitting traditional villages to autonomously define their own citizenship, then their local democracy can develop into an oligarchy that has all the problems of collective ownership without avoiding the problems of class inequality. Of course, feudalism is not the only way to integrate a village community into a larger state. A state with a weak ability to record and enforce property rights might have difficulty with the more complex alternatives, such as registering village land under the corporate ownership of a large but not all-inclusive group of local households, or of subdividing the land and recording the portions that are claimed by each household. So we can understand why weak states throughout history would opt for the simple alternative of designating individual lords for remote village communities, thus creating a powerful class of local leaders who share a strong interest in maintaining the state. But states with a large core of literate administrators have been able to distribute rights of ownership and responsibility for taxation more widely in the population. In the British administration of 19th century India, Maine heard from partisans of different state-building strategies. Some argued for concentrating land ownership in a native aristocracy, but others argued for recognizing peasants as owners of the land with responsibility for taxes distributed either to individuals or to organized village groups. That is, instead of creating a lord or zamindar for each village, the state could give responsibility for land taxes to the village council, or the state could collect taxes directly from individuals based on their registered property holdings. Comparing the regions of India where each system was used, Maine noted that the greatest prosperity could be found in the southern provinces where the government directly recognized individual cultivators of the soil as owners and taxpayers. Similar conclusions were found by Abhijit Banerjee and Lakshmi Iyer in their important paper in 2005. More than 130 years after Maine and 50 years after the end of more than 50 years after the end of British rule, Banerjee and Iyer still found evidence of lower agricultural productivity and higher infant mortality in areas where the British government had relied on local lords or zamindars. Feudalism may be the simplest strategy for establishing a stable political control over a wide region, but it can have serious long-term economic consequences. Much of global poverty today may be a legacy of such feudal strategies of traditional and colonial state building. Maine's prior book on ancient law was focused on the transition of Rome from a traditional village community to the capital of a great empire. Maine noted that as the Roman state grew in power, there was a gradual development from collective ownership by families to ownership by individuals, and also from rights defined by status in the community to rights defined by contracts. Economists understand the benefits of contracts and the costs of free rider moral hazard problems that are created by collective ownership. And as I've remarked, on the other hand, we can understand that individual ownership may be feasible only when a state's power to maintain order is great enough to make it realistic that an individual's property rights can be enforced without a large group sharing an intrinsic stake in those rights. But Maine also found that in the history of Rome, the state itself introduced the earliest demand for individual property rights. Property acquired by an individual in military service to the state was the first kind of property that a Roman was allowed to own as an individual, not subject to his family. When the expanding Roman state needed an individual's service, he gained the right to enjoy rewards from the state without interference from his father. At the end of his book on village communities, Maine noted one case of communities in history that were established with a traditional system of collective ownership, but made the transition all the way to individual ownership in a single generation. And that was in the 17th century settlement of New England that he noted this. Defense against native tribes there initially required collective ownership. But as the frontier became secure, small farmers could feel confident of the state's protection for their individual property rights because their locally elected representatives directed the government of the province. States have been organized, as I've noted, by groups of people with specialized administrative and military skills whose ability to achieve coordinated action depends on a dense network of relationships, trust, and leadership which bind them together like an elite village. In the simplest possible model, the founders of the state could be a band of captains with a leader whose power depends on a reputation among them for reliably rewarding their service. But the networks of trust within the state might not reach down into the local communities that are governed by the state when leaders of the state are not locally accountable. In much of history, when village communities were incorporated into a state by an invading force, the group that organized the state may have had little or no prior connection with the communities on which their rule would be imposed. And this was certainly true in colonial governments that were created by foreigners. In such cases, we should not be surprised to find a basic problem of building trust between local villagers and the government of the wider state in which they live. Srinivas, in his book The Remembered Village, tells of villages in colonial India where the arrival of a district magistrate would cause villagers to hide, fearing that official attention to them would be for conscription, taxation, or punishment, so that the village headman might be left alone to welcome the magistrate. But even in post-colonial Africa, Louise Fortman's remarkable 1983 report to the government of Botswana, a report on the role of local institutions in rural development, her report found a serious disconnection between the government and the locally trusted leadership of traditional village institutions. She remarked that, the whole quote I hope might be readable, those leaders in the village who truly have followers in the village, those leaders who truly have followers in the village, the traditional leaders, have weak links to the government, she said. And those with strong links to the government, especially the district councilors and the MPs, have few followers in the village. Louise Fortman observed that the government usually responded poorly to village development initiatives because nobody in the government was actually accountable to the villagers. She argued that villagers in rural Botswana had the skills and the organizational capacity for local institutions to assume a major role in self-sustaining development, but only if the government would let those local institutions exercise some real power to raise revenue, incur expenses, and enforce their decisions. In general, Africans under colonial rule would have had direct contact with the bureaucratic national agencies of imperialist governments, but not with the decentralized subnational levels of domestic politics on which these imperialist governments were based back home in Europe. So it's not surprising that after independence, post-colonial political elites in Africa might have viewed centralized national bureaucracy as a more modern way to integrate national power than the traditional institutions of local politics, which were dominated by traditional chiefs. However, in fact, traditional local institutions had vital roles in the historical process of building the strongest modern states of Europe and America. Since the 14th century, the institution of Parliament gave local leaders from the towns and counties of England an influential voice in their national politics. The United States was established in 1776 by 13 provincial assemblies, each consisting of local representatives who were elected by their communities. We should understand that the national governments of Britain and America achieved unprecedented wealth and power because their political systems were constitutionally designed to share power with local leaders of communities throughout the nation, and leaders in national politics could exercise power only with support from locally elected representatives. So let me try to conclude, I want to say that the point of this paper is that local bands and village communities have been able to generate the trusted leadership that they needed since prehistoric antiquity, as local leadership was essential for humanity's ability to transform the world, first when the hunter-gatherer bands spread out of Paleolithic Africa, and then in the farming communities which diffused from the Neolithic Middle East and other centers. And in more recent historical millennia, the growth of wider states has somewhat reduced the autonomy of village communities, has tended to reduce the autonomy of village communities, so that local authority could depend more on the external rulings of state officials and less on internal accountability to the community. But in less developed countries where the state capacity is weak, we should expect that local community leadership would still have some importance in people's lives. Thus, when the question is how to find responsible leadership to improve the provision of essential public goods for a whole nation, we should not ignore the supply of leadership that is available locally. Let me give a practical application. Local governments in poor communities, I should add, might not have the most modern administrative technology, and the potential constituency of some local politicians might be limited by their identification with one side of an ethnic rivalry. But economic development depends on political leadership, and the great successes of modern economic growth began in nations where local leadership was regularly integrated into national politics. From this perspective, in the conclusion, I suggest we may consider, for example, Afghanistan's National Solidarity Program to be a particularly well-designed development project. Under the National Solidarity Program, a village could get up to $60,000 US for development assistance after the villagers met to select a public improvement project and to elect a Village Development Commission, or VDC, which would take responsibility for managing the project with the NSP funds. The elected leaders of the Village Development Commission would get full responsibility for the project, but the National Solidarity Program administrators ensured that the VDC spent its funds with clear public accounting to the people of their village. A careful study of the NSP has found it to be a very effective way to help poor communities make public investments for better access to drinking water and electricity. The first goal of the first function of local government in the World Bank's report that I quoted at the start. The program may also have had some impact on local politics, as they found that the authors found that villagers were more likely to express critical discontent with the performance of their traditional village headman after members of the VDC had demonstrated their ability to manage public resources for village improvement. But the study does not indicate whether any villages ever subsequently acted to elect a new headman based on his good record of service with NSP funds. We should also ask whether any individuals have gone on to serve the public in higher offices, maybe at the district or provincial or national levels in Afghanistan, after first demonstrating that they could serve the public well in a National Solidarity Program Village Development Commission. If not, if nobody has done that, it may well be worth asking what barriers have prevented such democratic political advancement from local politics to national politics, which has regularly strengthened national democratic competition in successful democracies. Conversely, looking from the other direction of the problem of connecting the national government with local politics, we could also ask how the professional careers of government administrative officials might have been affected by an experience of working in the National Solidarity Program. Have administrative agents become more valuable to the national government and hence promoted after the NSP gave them a deeper familiarity with local politics in remote villages throughout the country? More generally, the point I'd like to make is that research in development economics should regularly consider questions of comparative local politics. I should tell you, whenever I hear a talk about research on economic problems in a poor community, I hope that the speaker might take a few minutes to say something about the forms of local leadership in the community. Who adjudicates local disputes among the poor people in the community? Who manages resources? Who manages public resources or coordinates communal efforts for local public improvements? And conversely, when we search for ways to strengthen the capacity of the state to provide essential public services for national development, we should not ignore the vast supply of public political capital, the trusted leadership that already exists in local communities throughout the country. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Roger. It's wonderful to see your application of your highly theoretical work in game theory into political science. Let's see what Kaushik, who is still from India, would have to say about this general theory from Roger.
Thank you, Celestin. Thank you, Roger. This paper, for me, was a very interesting read. And I'm quite fascinated by it because of what the second reading did it. When I read it first time, it was of some interest to me. Yes, it is important topics are being touched. Discussion of Indian village law. I knew a little bit about Maine and his work, so it was interesting. When I gave the second reading and a third reading, actually ideas began springing up, and I feel actually it touches on a variety of extremely important topics. One of the things that I would urge Roger to do, and this is not something that you do with every paper, this paper I feel there are parts of it which, if it's given a bit more of a formal structure, one will be able to get more out of it and win more people over to the position it's taking. And that I want to add the caveat that I'm acutely aware that some of the greatest ideas cannot be given a formal structure, but this one I think stands on the verge of that. And when I was reading, a couple of things struck me. One particular idea which I think is quite interesting. It gives a category of thought which would allow giving greater shape. It's just one building block. You'll need many things. And I thought, I've got three actually separate points, but I will start with this because I don't want to prolong, and the other points are interesting, I believe, but there's nothing very new in there. And I also want to hear a little bit of what Celestin may have to say. So let me give you the first point which is of great interest to me and which struck me. This is a new thing that struck me while I was reading this paper. If I have time, I'll get into the second one. So the local leadership, a lot of it is on that. And earlier, when doing the World Bank's World Development Report, I had had interaction with Roger. So this is something which one recognizes is extremely important. There are empirical papers which show the mode by which the local leadership is chosen makes a difference, and there's a lot to say over there. But one little thing was striking me, and I must read out. It was when I was reading this sentence that it struck me that there's possibility of a category, creating a conceptual category which would enhance the argument. Roger says in one place in the paper, we should understand that any military operation requires a leader. The leader needed in a military operation is used a little bit as an analogy, and then it is pointed out also, then or before that, a host of local government areas need coordination. Agriculture, you need some coordination across households. Now, in most places when coordination is needed, we think in terms of some simple rule which allows you to do the coordination, which relates to an idea which comes out of psychology but used in game theory, but I think beautifully, the notion of a focal point. So and I'm going to give you a game. Don't switch off as soon as you hear the word game. It's a very simple idea, and I'll illustrate to you the role of a focal point, and then I want to bring in how the focal point idea will not serve, and you need the concept of leadership at a local level out of that. So the game is as follows. Say 10 people are playing this game. Think of yourself as one of them. There is a chessboard-like board, 8 by 8, let there be no coloring, no black and white squares, just an 8 by 8 board. And the game is as follows. Each of these 10 players will have to choose one particular square independently. If all of them choose the same square, they'll get money, $100 each. If there's any variation, even one person chooses differently, no one gets nothing. In this game, there are of course lots of equilibria, because if you all choose the same square, no one has an interest in doing anything differently. So there are equilibria, but the trouble is, how do you know which one the other people are going for? The conceptual thing that game theorists used from a long time ago, which is a very beautiful idea, but it's very difficult to formalize what it is, but it's in human psychology. I now have the same board on the wall. I go up and say that I'm calling one square the golden square. And I mark it gold, and I say, nothing has changed by this. I just felt like marking it golden. You choose whatever square you want, and if all of you choose the same square, you get $100 each. You can be pretty sure what will happen. Virtually everyone will choose the golden square. By making one square salient, I've created a focal point, and that helps coordination. I believe, and there's a group of law and economics people, and there are legal scholars who take the same view, that laws and rules create focal points. Instead of making one square golden, I could just stand here and say that I'm making a rule. There's no police, nothing to enforce. Rule that all of you should choose the top left-hand corner square. In this case, the rule will be followed, pretty certain. There may be one or two perverse people, because people are desperate to coordinate. As soon as I create this rule, people will say, there's one clear salient square. I'm sure others are thinking of that. Let's follow the rule. The rule allows you coordination. Now, the war analogy made me think of this, which the agriculture, it crops up everywhere. In life, the game that will be played in a country, in small communities, village communities, the future game that will be played, very often in game theory, you talk of something called the game of life. So everything is known. These are the games that could be played in the future. In reality, you don't know what game is going to crop up for this village. There can be war. It could be the squares game. It could be a totally different game that will crop up. You don't even know quite the set of possible games that will arise in life. Military situation is exactly like that. There can be a dramatically new development where the local people need to coordinate. Here, for the leader at the top of the country, it's virtually impossible to give a rule in advance, because you don't know whether it will be the squares game or a totally different game. What is the rule? If I knew it's a squares game, I'd say the top left-hand corner or the bottom right-hand corner. If I have no idea what's the game, what do I do? One way out of this is to move away from a focal point to think of a focal person. Make a local person focal. Say that this person is your leader. That can have, you don't have to do anything else. This person now takes on the responsibility of the 10 players when the game crops up. This person says that this is the way we are going to behave, and facilitates coordination. So the role of a local leader is, when you don't know the set of games that can arise, the creation of a leader is the creation of a focal, not a point, but a focal person, who it is understood is going to create the rules as and when the situation crops up, and allow the local community to coordinate. I believe somehow the concept of a focal person can be used then to think in terms of different kinds of local situations arising, different kinds of local government. I've said this quickly enough, so allow me 2-3 more minutes to give the second idea, which is something actually with Avinash Dixit. I've done a little bit of thinking on this, and we also have a short paper. Again, reading your paper took me to that. We usually think of a very sharp division between the state and corporations and firms. But some of the local administrative rules, like the village rules, could also be dispersed to corporations to do some of the administration which is meant to be done by the government. And the analogy is a bit like this. Suppose there are 10,000 burger stores in the country. 10,000 burger stores, and you want the burgers to follow certain rules. You have to make sure that it's meat of a certain quality, bread of a certain quality. Very difficult for government to enforce this. However, instead of there being 10,000 burger stores, if there are 2 burger companies, McDonald's and Burger King, with franchises, 5,000 each, then you can pass on some of the administrative rules that, look, certain quality standards have to be maintained to the big corporation. You don't have to go looking around who's violated. If there is a violation, you hold the whole corporation responsible. With small players, the trouble is, and this is another problem, when a single player makes something wrong, the limit of punishment is limited. After all, there is limited liability. What can you do to an individual or a small firm? But if that individual or the firm is a part of a larger firm, then part of the administration is that if there is violation by this small unit, you make the whole unit responsible and try to punish the whole unit. McDonald's is held responsible for that small burger shop which did something wrong. So part of this kind of decentralization of administration could actually take place not just to local government, but local government village councils, but even to firms and corporations. They can be given some of the responsibilities. Is possible. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Kaushik. We could almost open it now for questions. I'm sure there will be several. Perhaps let me just take 2-3 minutes and add a little bit of commentary to what Kaushik just said. First, this is indeed a really excellent paper, and like all papers by Roger, it's available online on his website, so I would strongly encourage you to print it and look at it. It's not always easy to present something this theoretical in a 30-20 minutes chat. So I strongly encourage you to look at the paper. The way I would summarize it in one sentence would be, how do you build the kind of trust which is transformational? That's the way I would put it. And of course, Roger's thesis is very, very straightforward, very bold. Successful democratic development, according to Roger, depends on a large supply of leaders with good reputation for managing public resources responsibly. So that's the first big idea, a big statement in his paper. And the second one that he discussed at length is the notion that the best place to develop this kind of political capital is actually at the local level. Now, if you're familiar with the work that he's been doing in recent years, there's a resonance with previous work. It makes a lot of sense, including intuitively. But reading the paper, and again, being from Cameroon, not being an American citizen, I wanted to ask myself whether some of these suggestions, and it's more than suggestion, it's actually a very strong theory backed up with strong historical evidence, which he has painstakingly gathered from a lot of readings. I was wondering whether this would apply not only to the US of a time, but also beyond the US. And I was hoping that Kaushik would perhaps say something about India and how this Roger Mason's suggestion might or might not work in India. Of course, at face value, you would say, well, Prime Minister Modi, who did amazing work by all accounts in Gujarat as chief minister, became prime minister in 2014, and basically following this trajectory that Roger has described. The question is how general this is, including in the US. And in fact, before this chat, I was teasing Roger, asking him if the election of Donald Trump will fit his theory. he said to me, I have an answer. So I hope maybe he will give us that answer. Because, of course, Donald Trump was never elected to any office. He's probably the only person, or one of the few people in the history of America to ever hold this kind of position without ever going through the local circuit. Now, the question is whether he will be considered a good leader, a successful leader. Everybody may have their own opinions on this. And this is one of the things that I wanted to stress in my comment. And I agree with Kaushik on the notion that this paper may need a really formal model, a formal structure, so that we could all go through everything, all the assumptions, and see carefully when and how it can be actually used and when it could not be used. The very definition of what a successful leader or successful democratic experiment is, I think, is not necessarily obvious. It has to be, I believe, stated more precisely. Is it based on performance? Is it based on legitimacy? We can imagine a whole set of criteria. The second little quibble I would have with Roger maybe on the obvious linearity of the model, of the theory. And again, if you look at history, especially outside of the US, and you look at different political traditions, there are many places on earth where successful, whatever you define it, successful leadership, successful democratic experiment have been led by people who had no local legitimacy. In fact, there are many places where people actually gain local legitimacy by starting first at the central level and being successful there, and then being parachuted or going back to local communities and excelling there. Of course, I'm Cameroonian, and part of my heritage is the French Jacobin, État Jacobin, very centralized system. And I've observed that in many Francophone countries. But beyond Francophone countries, you have these non-linearities that may need to be integrated into your thinking about this. You mentioned Afghanistan. Well, it's an interesting case. We could mention Iraq, too. And the work that political scientists like Larry Diamond and others have been doing on Iraq, for instance, may lead you to perhaps enrich what you have to say on this theory. And the broader question there is whether your thinking would also work in societies which have a history of fractionalization. And where somebody can be actually successful, again, whatever you define success, at the local level, and then go to the central level and not behave for the common good, not realizing that their role may have changed, and creating at the central level problems that they did not or couldn't create at the local level. Another question that I had reading this wonderful paper has to do with the importance of leadership. I've always been puzzled with leadership. One of my former teachers, Paul Collier, always tells me that good leadership is the kind of leadership that makes leadership irrelevant. And the first time I heard that, I asked him to explain what he meant by that. He said, well, you guys in Africa have been, for the past 30 years, looking for a new Nelson Mandela. No, you shouldn't have been doing that. A good leader is a leader that manages to convince others to put in place good institutions so that nobody ever has to wait for a good leader for society to function more or less well. So, and again, your paper, Roger, made me think about the importance. I even wonder the fixation on leadership, what kind of leadership and how. And again, I think Paul Collier is right in the sense that you will not have Nelson Mandela's produced every day. You need to do with the leaders that you have, and what really counts, in my view, is the strength of the institution. And perhaps one last point, and then I'll open, we need to hear from you, and hear back from Roger and Kaushik. Something which I, perhaps because of my current position for the past few months, I've been the chief economist of the African Development Bank, and living in Africa after being away for many years makes me realize the importance, the critical importance of knowledge, more than anything else. And I've been reading a lot about the history of the Industrial Revolution, and there are many different opinions there. Broadly speaking, some people explain it, capital, technological advance, and so on. Others explain it through institution and political institutions. But there's new, very exciting work which seems to suggest that the role of knowledge, the diffusion of knowledge, actually starting at the end of the 16th century, may have contributed more to the Industrial Revolution than anything else. Of course, we'll have time to debate that, but this is something which I wanted to suggest to Roger to look into. Now, time is always a strange concept. Deng Xiaoping, whom I don't know, would probably not qualify to be a successful democratic leader, but maybe 200 years from now, he will be seen as a great leader. We'll see. But Deng Xiaoping is said, I mean, people say that in 1989, 200 years after the French Revolution, 1989, he was asked what he thought of the French Revolution. And he paused for a moment and said, well, it's a bit early to say. So maybe, Roger, your brilliant thesis is, it's a bit early for us to decide whether it's a bit early. So let's open up for questions. Yes, please introduce yourself, and then there's a microphone behind you.
Okay, the introduction is not necessary. Professor Meissen, if I can ask you this question. So when you spoke of leadership, you spoke of a number of requirements, things like being accountable, things like being an efficient manager of public resources. How would you compare leadership of this variety, the efficacy of leadership of this variety, to leadership bred at, quote unquote, Eton and Harrow? In other words, is leadership something that can be taught? Is it something that can be learned by emulation?
Okay, thank you. Since we don't have a lot of time, let's take a couple more if there are other questions. Right in front of you.
Roger Myerson made a very compelling point for community governance and community leadership, but perhaps a word of caution might be in order. It is often said that community governance is susceptible to capture simply because there is not enough of competition at the community level and because there are fewer checks and balances that could be available at higher jurisdictional levels. Robert Putnam argued that decentralization of government in Italy failed in southern Italy simply because mafia took over local governments. And this morning there was a paper saying that in Colombia, local governments, local order was often maintained by organized crime networks. And speaking about Africa, Asimoglu, Robinson, and Reed published a paper in Sierra Leone when they showed that in some areas of Sierra Leone, local chiefs were actually able to capture community development, although they enjoyed high level of popularity. But when there were fewer checks and balances on these local chiefs, development outcomes were much worse. So my question is, how would you address this concern? Thanks.
Okay, right in front of you.
So the story of local governance is compelling, but there is an alternative story of coming together, of reducing distance between communities. And development is not just like building social capital at local level, it's developing national markets and getting otherwise different communities that have different preferences, different history, to actually work together. You know, and I think that element might be a little bit missing in your discussion. I would like to see whether you want to comment on that part. You know, to go from local to national, there is a process, which is one in which different communities get together, work together, and develop national institutions.
Okay, I don't see any other hands, so let's take this first round. Roger, and of course, Kaushik, feel free, please, to jump in if you want to.
Let me say first about the question about leadership be taught. I don't know. It sounds, I wish I envy those who had a good education at Eton, and I wonder what they've learned. I think if I were going to teach someone about leadership, I take the classic ancient text on leadership that was Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, and to summarize the lesson in that, I would have suggested Xenophon's cartoon history of you know, it's a model of Cyrus suggests that the leadership on which great states are built could be described in one English word. What attribute do I think, to back up and say that in those places where there are still bookstores, one can find whole shelves of books about leadership, and I would say the modal property of a leader in those books is visionary strategic planner. But that really could be subcontracted to somebody from McKinsey. I think that to me, the essential element of leadership, to summarize it in one word, the personal characteristic a leader needs is gratitude. That is, gratitude means when people serve you, when people can count on you to be grateful and to respond positively in the long run, if not in the short, to things that they do for you. I would have said it, by the way, I think I'd love, when back off from the questions for just a minute and go back to Kaushik's discussion, I particularly appreciate the focal point effect. We've both written, I think what I wrote about the focal point was based on what he wrote about the focal point. So we have a long history that I'm proud of dialogue on this. But when I said in my paper, when I talk about the leadership for military operations, there is, of course, shall we attack at dawn or attack, you know, at dusk, and we better get it right. There might be a vision, and sort of we've all seen movies where a talented military leader knows just what kind of terrain or weather is going to be perfect to maximize the possibility of success in their operation. But the more mundane and I think essential aspect that I tried to emphasize, I said the military leader needs to tell people to do things that are dangerous, and then he needs also thereafter to have a reputation for rewarding them reliably when they actually do the mission. Individuals are going to risk their lives in various ways. We're not all going to risk our lives the same way, so some people are going to do some things that are more dangerous, and the guy who's ordering that needs to have resources. The reason I like that in an economics conference is because it means that kind of traditional leader, and I was trying to lay the groundwork for the traditional chief of the traditional local community. He does need that kind of leadership requires some control of resources, because he's got to be able to at least allocate the booty after the successful battle, after the I think so. I wanted to build a case for a model that required a leader to actually, even when we haven't yet defined what are property rights, to have control over valuable resources, and you need the valuable resources at least to be able to have some control over the distribution of valuable resources to reward those people who have carried out dangerous commands that you gave. On community governance can be captured. I'm from Chicago, and I certainly know that local government can be more corrupt than national government. The main thesis one of the main theses when I talked about the modern state was that local government, while being regularly more corrupt than national government, I believe countries that have democratic local government then have less corrupt national government than they would have had otherwise, because of the possibility of the best of local leaders rising to higher office. So the interaction between national and local government actually works better when most local governments are very corrupt, and then the one mayor who cleans up the city makes himself a strong candidate for higher office. I would argue that when people in countries where people have difficulty trusting anyone in the political system, the process of building trust can start better locally, because there are more parallel opportunities to begin building trust. We only need one or two leaders who we can trust. We need not one, we need two, so they can compete with each other at the higher levels. We'll see how it goes in Kenya, which is decentralized. I understand there are many county governors that seem to be using their power for personal gain, but there are, I think, 40-something counties, and we only need a couple to start something better in Kenyan government, to start showing the people of Kenya that some elected leaders can do better for them than they've seen in the past. I think, by the way, in terms of local autocracy, in other papers I've talked about the stability of democracy. I think is stronger when it's on multiple levels. That national democracy also helps to strengthen local democracy. That of course local communities can become autocracies just as much as extended nations, where whoever has the power then hires muscle to intimidate opposition. However, if as I say, I come from a one-party city-state in Chicago, but if the one-party government, if the dominant local boss is genuinely unpopular with the mass of the population because he's only serving a small number of cronies, then in a nation that has a competitive democratic system, surely it should be. I think it is within the capabilities of the national government and the parties to intervene to guarantee at least the right of the local population to vote against the boss. That is to say, that can be protected when the community is part of a larger democracy. Bringing together communities into nations. The main theme I was trying to talk about today was to indicate that in much of history, state building has been by a conqueror, or by invasion, or by an elite group, an elite aristocracy, and therefore it didn't necessarily interact well with the institutions of the institutions of trust that won people's trust in local communities, that people have built at much lower levels. I certainly would argue that the great strength of the United States comes from its having had very decentralized political roots, and I believe that the strongest modern states in the process, I think, Leonard, that you're asking about, are that the best way to build a state is by a political movement that first builds that begins with the leadership that people trust in their communities, and that the modern state has a different attitude, has a different relationship with local communities than the traditional state, which often as not was originally based on some sort of conquest. Not always, of course. Let me say about the United States, and answer your by the way, that it's no secret that I worked for the other candidate and was disappointed with the outcome of the American presidential election. However, this 2016 was the first time in American history, I believe, that the Americans have elected somebody who did not have any prior experience or history in his life of holding public power responsibly. George Washington, there was no constitution, but he held great public power in commanding the armed forces under the Articles of Confederation, and showed that he was willing to exercise that power within law and within limits. We've now elected someone if I could talk to the people of America, I would say some of you admire Donald Trump, and I understand that he won because he got millions of votes, and many of those people may genuinely admire him. But I would have suggested that he should have run, they should have urged him to run for governor of some state first. He had property in many states and could have done so. And then after 4 years, he could have, if he had still a good reputation with enough people, perhaps he could have run for president. I worry about, can we hope that people will suddenly get a desire to uphold the Constitution and the law when they've never done so before, would never had any responsibility before on arriving at the pinnacle of power. But let me say, from my perspective as an American, those countries where there is only centralized, that are truly democracies that have only centralized power, that is, every election is about electing the national leadership, in those countries, I feel one way to describe it is when the people when people in the country no longer they don't trust any of the major parties in the capital, they have no choice but to elect a Donald Trump. Not necessarily his particular characteristics, but somebody who has no track record whatsoever, and anybody can talk a good game about, vote for me and I will fight corruption and make government serve the people. The question is, have I ever exercised a public budget? And I haven't. So that in American history, there have been many times, but until when American voters have turned to an outsider, typically a governor who had done well. And this is the first time when uncharacteristically, instead of electing a governor when they were disgusted or disappointed with Washington, of what was going on in the nation's capital, they turned to a businessman who had done nothing but manipulate the law to his advantage in his career. So that doesn't bode well for the Constitution, but I think the decentralized strength of the Constitution will survive. Sorry,
well, thank you. We still have time for a second round of questions, if they are... No? Washik, you wanted to... Well, thank you very, very much. You've been a very nice and polite audience. Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Kaushik.